A tiny disabled girl begs a millionaire for help, barely able to lift her head from her wheelchair. At first, he sees just another child in need, until she hands him something that stops him cold. It's a broken violin, with markings only one person could have left behind. Suddenly, he bursts into tears right there in the hospital lobby, because this little girl doesn't just remind him of his past. She connected to it in a way no one could have imagined. Who is she really? And what did she say that shattered a billionaire's silence after 10 years? This is a story about the pain we hide, the music we carry, and the unexpected bond that could heal them both. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The sleek black car glided through downtown traffic, its tinted windows shielding Vincent Hale from the outside world. He sat rigidly in the back seat, his steel gray suit perfectly pressed, not a single silver hair out of place. His eyes remained fixed on his phone, thumb scrolling through endless emails. "Mr. Hale?" Sarah, his assistant, cleared her throat from the seat beside him. When he didn't look up, she tried again. "Mr. Hale, we need to review the hospital visit protocol." Vincent's jaw tightened. "I know how to visit a hospital, Sarah." "Yes, sir, but the board specifically requested." She shuffled through her tablet. "They want you to appear more approachable. Remember to smile. Try to look human." Vincent's voice was cold as he finally looked up from his phone. "Is that the word you're searching for?" Sarah's cheeks flushed pink. "The press will be there. After last quarter's incidents, we need some positive coverage. The children's hospital visit could really help our public image." Vincent returned to his phone, his expression unchanged. The last thing he wanted was to parade through hospital halls, pretending to care about sick children while cameras flashed in his face. He had built his empire through calculated decisions and unwavering focus, not through publicity stunts. The car pulled up to the hospital's main entrance. Through the window, Vincent could see the small crowd gathered. Hospital administrators in their best suits, local news crews setting up cameras, nurses trying to look busy yet available for comment. 20 minutes, Vincent said firmly, not a minute more. Sarah nodded, relief visible on her face. "Of course, Mr. Hale. That's all we need." Vincent stepped out of the car, straightening his tie. The hospital CEO practically bounced forward to shake his hand, speaking rapidly about donation opportunities and new wing proposals. Vincent nodded mechanically, following the group into the lobby. The space was bright and modern with cheerful murals covering the walls. Children's artwork hung in frames, and motivational quotes about healing were stenciled everywhere. Vincent checked his watch. 19 minutes to go. That's when he heard it, a single wavering note floating through the air. The sound was weak and slightly off-key, but something about it made Vincent freeze mid-step. Another note followed, then another, forming a hesitant melody that seemed to pierce straight through his carefully constructed walls. Without realizing it, Vincent had turned away from the group following the sound. The CEO was still talking, but Vincent couldn't hear him anymore. The melody pulled him down a side corridor, past a small waiting area until he found its source. A tiny figure sat in a wheelchair that had seen better days. The girl couldn't have been more than 8, swimming in a hospital gown decorated with faded butterflies. Her dark hair was pulled back in uneven pigtails, and her small fingers were wrapped in multiple band-aids as she struggled with a violin that was much too big for her. The violin itself was in terrible shape. 2 strings were clearly broken, the wood was scratched and dull, and the bow was missing half its horsehair. But the girl kept playing, her face scrunched in concentration as she tried to coax music from the damaged instrument. Vincent stood rooted to the spot, unable to move. He knew that violin. He would know it anywhere. The subtle grain of the wood, the distinctive curve of its scroll, and there, on the side, the small carved initials that made his heart stop. S.H. The girl looked up, her large brown eyes meeting his. Despite her obvious illness, there was a brightness in them that reminded Vincent of another pair of eyes he'd tried so hard to forget. She lowered the bow, offering him a small smile. "Can you fix this?" she asked softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "My daddy gave it to me before he went to heaven." Vincent's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. The violin in the girl's lap was impossible to mistake. It was Sienna's, his daughter's prized possession. The violin he'd given her for her 10th birthday, the one she'd played at every recital except the last one. The one he'd missed because of an important meeting. The one scheduled for the day The memories he'd locked away for years came crashing through his defenses. Sienna practicing in the living room, her face lighting up when she mastered a difficult passage. The way she'd bounded into his study every evening, eager to show him what she'd learned. The violin case collecting dust in his home office, untouched since that final day. Vincent felt something wet on his cheek. He reached up, surprised to find tears streaming down his face. His chest constricted painfully as more tears followed. Years of buried grief breaking free in front of clicking cameras and startled onlookers. "Mr. Hale." Sarah's voice seemed to come from far away. She appeared at his side, trying to shield him from the press. "Mr. Hale, please, let's step outside for a moment." But Vincent couldn't move. He stood there, tears flowing freely now, staring at his daughter's violin in the hands of this fragile child who somehow played the exact melody Sienna had been practicing on that last morning. The cameras continued to flash, capturing the unprecedented sight of Vincent Hale, the stone-faced billionaire, the man Forbes had once called the human calculator, crying openly in a hospital corridor. Sarah was practically pulling at his arm now, whispering urgently about damage control and press statements. The little girl in the wheelchair just watched him with those knowing eyes, still holding Sienna's violin with gentle care, as if she understood exactly what was breaking inside him. The sun had long since set when Vincent's car finally pulled up to the gates of his estate. The massive iron barriers slid open silently, allowing the vehicle to wind its way up the long driveway, lined with perfectly manicured trees. Their shadows stretched across the pristine lawn like reaching fingers in the gathering darkness. Vincent hadn't spoken a word since leaving the hospital. His phone had buzzed constantly, calls from the PR team, board members, and various news outlets. But he'd switched it off hours ago. Sarah had tried to arrange an emergency meeting to handle the media fallout, but Vincent had dismissed her with a wave of his hand before retreating into his car. The mansion loomed before him, its modern architecture a statement of wealth and precision. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflected the last remnants of twilight, making the house look like it was built from shadows and light. Vincent stepped out of the car, his normally confident stride unsteady. His suit jacket was creased from sitting too long, his tie loosened, small imperfections that would normally bother him. But tonight he didn't notice. The house was silent as he entered, his footsteps echoing off marble floors and stark white walls. Everything was immaculate, sterile, more like a museum than a home. Vincent had preferred it that way since Sienna's death. Clean lines, no clutter, no memories. But tonight, the emptiness felt different, suffocating. His eyes drifted to the grand staircase, past the second floor where his home office was located, up to the third floor where a hidden door led to the attic. He hadn't been up there in over 10 years, had sworn he never would again. Vincent's feet moved of their own accord, carrying him up the stairs. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the banister, solid mahogany, polished to a mirror shine. Sienna used to slide down it when she thought he wasn't looking. He could still hear her giggles the way she'd try to look innocent when he caught her. The third-floor hallway was dark. Vincent didn't bother with the lights as he made his way to the far end, where a small door was concealed in the wall's paneling. The key was still in his pocket, on the same ring he used every day. He'd never removed it, though he'd told himself countless times to do so. The door creaked as it opened, protesting years of disuse. A narrow staircase led up into darkness. Vincent pulled out his phone, using its light to guide him into the attic space. Dust motes danced in the beam and the air felt thick with age and silence. Boxes lined the walls, each labeled with mechanical precision. Tax records, business documents, old contracts. Vincent moved past them all, toward the far corner where a single box sat apart from the others. Even in the dim light he could make out the words written in his own hand. "Sienna, don't open." Vincent's knees felt weak as he knelt beside the box. Dust had settled on its lid, untouched for a decade. His fingers hovered over the cardboard flaps, trembling more violently now. The hospital girl's face flashed in his mind, her gentle smile, those knowing eyes, the way she'd played that melody. He opened the box. The scent of vanilla and rosin wafted up, Sienna's scent. Vincent's breath caught in his throat. On top was a stack of recital programs, each one carefully preserved. He lifted them with shaking hands, remembering how proud Sienna had been to see her name printed on them. "Look, Dad," she'd say, pointing to where it read, "Sienna Hale, violin," in elegant script. Beneath the programs were photographs. Sienna at 5, holding her first tiny violin with a gap-toothed grin. At 8, performing at her school talent show. At 12, teaching younger children at the community center. Vincent's vision blurred as he sorted through them, years of memories he'd locked away flooding back. A folder of sheet music came next. Vincent recognized Sienna's handwriting, the way she'd make little notes in the margins about tempo and dynamics. The last piece was unfinished, the notes trailing off mid-measure. She'd been working on it the morning of her final day, humming the melody as she wrote. At the bottom of the box was a large envelope containing photos from her volunteer work. Sienna had insisted on teaching music at a local shelter, using her own allowance to buy instruments for the children there. Vincent had been too busy to attend any of her lessons, always promising next time. He pulled out the last photograph and his world stopped spinning. The picture showed Sienna sitting at a beaten-up piano surrounded by children. She was 15, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, face animated as she demonstrated something on the keys. And there, standing right beside her with tiny hands resting on the piano, was a little girl no more than 4 years old. Alara. Vincent recognized her immediately, despite the years between then and now. The same soulful eyes, the same gentle expression. She was smaller, healthier, but unmistakably the same child who had played Sienna's violin in the hospital today. The photograph slipped from Vincent's numb fingers, floating to the floor like a fallen leaf. He stared at it, unable to process the connection that had been there all along. Sienna had known Alara, had taught her, had probably been one of the last people to make music with her before. Vincent's legs gave out entirely, and he sank to the dusty attic floor. The weight of understanding pressed down on him like a physical force. He'd been so consumed by his own grief, so determined to bury the past that he'd abandoned everything Sienna had cared about. The music program at the shelter had died without its benefactor. The children she'd taught had been forgotten, children like Alara. He reached out and placed Sienna's violin, the one Alara had somehow ended up with, next to the open box. The two pieces of his daughter's legacy, side by side in the attic's darkness. Vincent sat there, surrounded by memories and missed opportunities as waves of guilt threatened to drown him. No words came. None could have expressed the magnitude of what he'd allowed to happen. He simply sat in silence, the kind of silence that had filled his life since losing Sienna. Only now, for the first time, he felt its true emptiness. The morning sun filtered through Vincent's office windows, casting long shadows across his desk. He hadn't slept. His usually pristine appearance showed signs of wear. His collar was unbuttoned, his hair slightly disheveled. The photograph from the attic lay before him, its edges worn with age. Vincent picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the number he needed. James Morton had been his private investigator for 15 years, handling everything from corporate espionage to background checks on potential business partners. He answered on the first ring. "Mr. Hale," James said, his voice professional and clipped. "This is unexpected." "I need you to look into someone," Vincent said, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "A child at Metropolitan Children's Hospital. Her name is Alara." He paused, looking at the photograph. "I'm sending you an old picture. She's the small girl next to my daughter." Vincent held the photo up to his phone's camera, capturing it carefully before sending it through. "I need everything. Her full name, background, current living situation. Most importantly, I need to know how she came to possess my daughter's violin." "The Stradivarius?" James asked, surprise evident in his tone. "Yes." Vincent's fingers drummed against his desk. I want the report today, whatever it costs. I'll have it for you by this afternoon, James promised. Vincent spent the next several hours pacing his office, unable to focus on work. The morning's newspapers lay unopened on his desk, their headlines undoubtedly questioning his emotional breakdown at the hospital. He couldn't bring himself to care. At 2 o'clock, James arrived at the mansion. The investigator looked grave as he placed a thick manila folder on Vincent's desk. "You might want to sit down for this, Mr. Hale," James said quietly. Vincent lowered himself into his chair, opening the folder with steady hands that belied his inner turmoil. The first page held a photograph of a woman he vaguely remembered. Maria Esteban, age 32. Dark hair, kind eyes that reminded him of Alara's. Maria Esteban was employed as a live-in housekeeper at your Verde Valley estate from 2015 to 2018, James began, his tone carefully neutral. She worked primarily in the East Wing where your daughter had her music room. Vincent's throat tightened. He remembered now, Maria had been quiet, efficient, always keeping to herself. He'd barely noticed her presence. In late 2018, she filed a formal complaint against Jonathan Pierce, your then partner at Hale Enterprises. The complaint alleged multiple instances of verbal and physical abuse. James paused, watching Vincent's face carefully. The complaint was buried. Pierce arranged for her immediate termination and had her arrested on false charges of theft. Vincent's hands clenched into fists. Pierce had been forced out of the company 2 years later for similar behavior, but Vincent had never known about Maria. He'd been too consumed with his own grief over Sienna to pay attention to the lives of his staff. Maria died in state prison 8 months into her sentence, James continued. The official cause was untreated pneumonia, though the prison's medical records show multiple requests for care that were ignored. Vincent felt sick. He turned the page, finding a child services report with Alara's picture paperclipped to the corner. She couldn't have been more than 5 in the photo, her eyes already holding a sadness no child should know. Alara Esteban, age 8. After her mother's death, she entered the foster system. Multiple placements, none lasting more than a few months. She was diagnosed with spinal muscular atrophy type 3 at age 6, which complicated placement efforts. She's currently a ward of the state, residing at Metropolitan Children's Hospital due to recent complications from her condition. James pulled out another document, a property receipt. The violin came into her possession through a donation to the group home where she was staying last year. The home regularly receives items from estate sales and charitable organizations. According to their records, the violin was part of a lot of items donated by the Verde Valley Estate's housekeeping staff after the property was sold. Vincent remembered now. He'd ordered the estate cleared out after Sienna's death, unable to bear visiting it again. He'd never bothered to check what happened to its contents. The staff must have recognized it as belonging to Sienna, James said softly. They probably knew about the connection between Maria and your daughter, the music lessons at the shelter, the time they spent together at the estate. Vincent stood abruptly, walking to the window. The manicured gardens below seemed to mock him with their perfection, their careful ordering that hid so much neglect beneath the surface. "There's more," James said. "Alara's condition. It's degenerative. The hospital records indicate dash." "That's enough," Vincent cut him off. He couldn't bear to hear more, not yet. His eyes fell on a hospital pamphlet that had been included in the folder. It showed the children's wing, with its cheerfully painted walls and medical equipment trying desperately to look less threatening. Vincent picked up the pamphlet, noting Alara's unit number printed inside. Room 412, Pediatric Long-Term Care. His pen moved almost of its own accord, circling the number. "Will that be all, Mr. Hale?" James asked quietly. Vincent nodded, still staring at the circled room number. "Yes, thank you, James." He reached for his checkbook, but James shook his head. "No charge for this one, sir." The investigator gathered his coat and headed for the door, pausing briefly. "For what it's worth, Mr. Hale, you can't change the past, but tomorrow's still unwritten." After James left, Vincent sat at his desk for a long time, reading through the report again and again. Each detail felt like another weight added to his shoulders. He'd failed not just Sienna, but everyone she'd cared about. His daughter had seen value in people he'd considered invisible, had given her time and love to children like Alara, while he'd been too busy building his empire to notice. The circled room number seemed to stare back at him from the pamphlet. Tomorrow, he decided. Tomorrow he would go back to the hospital, not for publicity, not for his company's image, but for answers. He owed that much to Sienna's memory, and to Alara, whose life had been shaped by his indifference. Vincent carefully placed the report in his briefcase alongside the old photograph of Sienna and Alara at the piano. The connection between past and present was clear now, drawn in lines of loss and missed opportunities. But perhaps it wasn't too late to make things right. The morning sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as Vincent pulled into a space far from the main entrance. He'd left his usual driver at home, choosing instead to take an unmarked sedan from his personal collection. Gone was the tailored suit and Italian leather shoes. Today he wore khakis and a simple blue button-down shirt, his silver hair unstyled. At the reception desk, he cleared his throat softly. "I'm here from the Hale Foundation Donor Board," he said, presenting his foundation ID rather than his personal credentials. "I'd like to visit the long-term pediatric care wing." The receptionist barely glanced at his ID, typing something into her computer. "4th floor, take a right off the elevator. You'll need to check in at the nurses' station." Vincent's footsteps echoed in the sterile hallway as he made his way to the elevator. His heart pounded harder with each floor they passed. The doors opened to a corridor painted with cheerful murals of forests and animals, a stark contrast to the medical equipment lining the walls. At the nurses' station, a woman in bright purple scrubs looked up from her charts. "Can I help you?" "I'm from the Hale Foundation," Vincent repeated his cover story. "We're considering additional funding for the long-term care wing. I'd like to observe some of the patients, if possible." The nurse, her nameplate read Sarah, nodded knowingly. "Of course, most of our patients are having therapy sessions right now, but..." She consulted her computer. "Room 412 is available. Alara's there. She's one of our long-term residents." Vincent's throat tightened at the casual mention of her name. He followed Sarah down the hallway, past rooms filled with beeping machines and soft conversations. They stopped outside 412, where Sarah knocked gently before pushing the door open. The room was shared, with 2 beds separated by a curtain, though only one was occupied. Alara sat cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by sheets of blank paper. She was humming softly to herself, her small hand making sweeping motions across the page as she drew what looked like musical notes. The broken violin lay beside her, its damaged strings catching the morning light. "Alara, honey," Sarah called softly. "You have a visitor from the donor board." Alara looked up, her face breaking into a wide smile that transformed her entire appearance. There was no recognition in her eyes. She didn't connect him to the man who'd broken down in the lobby days before. "Hi," she said brightly, waving a paper-covered hand. "Do you like music too?" Vincent nodded, finding it difficult to speak. Sarah squeezed his shoulder encouragingly before leaving them alone. "I'm Alara," she continued, patting the edge of her bed in invitation. "And this is Mr. Squeak." She gestured to the violin. "He's feeling tired today. Sometimes his strings get sleepy and don't want to sing properly." Vincent carefully sat where indicated, noting how she had arranged her IV tubing in neat parallel lines along the bed rail, mimicking violin strings. "You take good care of him," he managed to say. "Oh yes," Alara nodded seriously. "He needs lots of love, just like people do." She picked up the violin, positioning it under her chin despite its awkward size. Her bandaged fingers moved across the strings in a practiced motion, and though no sound emerged, she closed her eyes and swayed slightly. "Can you hear it?" she whispered. "The song's still there, even when it's quiet." Vincent watched in amazement as she continued to play, her movements following a melody only she could hear. Her face was peaceful, transported somewhere beyond the hospital walls. "That's beautiful," he said softly when she finished. "Thank you," Alara beamed. "Mr. Squeak taught me that one. He knows lots of songs, but sometimes he's shy about sharing them." She leaned forward conspiratorially. I think he misses his old friend. She used to play him all the time before she went to heaven. Vincent's hands trembled in his lap. How do you know that? Because he tells me, Ilara said simply. When I hold him just right, I can feel all the happy memories stored up inside. She demonstrated, pressing her cheek against the violin's worn wood. See? He's warm right here. That means someone loved him very much. Sarah appeared in the doorway carrying a tray of medications. Ilara plays that violin every day, she told Vincent quietly. Says the music keeps her strong, even when we can't hear it. I've never seen anything like it. Her vitals actually improve when she's playing. Ilara nodded enthusiastically, though the movement left her slightly breathless. Music is magic, she declared. It lives inside you forever, even after the song ends. She reached for one of her papers, folding it carefully along invisible lines. Vincent realized it was a sheet of music torn from an old book. Her small fingers worked quickly despite their bandages, transforming the page into a delicate paper flower. Here, she said, holding it out to Vincent. I think Mr. Squeak likes you. He gets extra warm when you're nearby. Vincent accepted the flower with trembling hands, noting the faded musical notes that formed its petals. The paper was soft with age and handling, as though Ilara had folded and unfolded it many times before. Visiting hours are ending soon, Sarah announced gently from the doorway. Vincent stood, his legs unsteady. He wanted to say something, anything, but words failed him completely. Ilara didn't seem to mind, giving him another bright smile as she returned to her drawing. He walked out of the room in silence, the paper flower clutched carefully in his hand. Just outside the door, his legs gave out. He slid down the wall until he was sitting on the floor, the flower cradled in his palm. The hallway bustled with end-of-day activity, nurses changing shifts, dinner carts being wheeled past, families saying goodbye to loved ones. But Vincent couldn't move. The weight of everything, Sienna, Maria, Ilara, all the lives he'd touched without realizing it, held him there, his back against the wall, as Ilara's soft humming drifted through the door. He wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Not when there was so much he needed to understand, so much he needed to make right. He sat there, listening to the gentle melody of a broken violin that somehow still sang, played by a little girl who heard music in the silence. Vincent's footsteps echoed through his empty mansion as he carried Ilara's violin to the dining room. The space felt cavernous, decorated in chrome and glass that reflected the dim evening light. He hadn't used this room for actual dining in years. It had become just another sterile space in a house that had long ago stopped feeling like a home. He placed the violin carefully on the polished mahogany table, positioning it under the soft glow of a pendant lamp. The worn wood and damaged strings were even more apparent in this light. Scratches marked the surface like battle scars, telling stories of love and neglect. One string hung completely loose, while another was held together with what looked like medical tape. Ilara's creative solution to keep her beloved instrument whole. Vincent's hands shook slightly as he walked to his study. In the bottom drawer of his desk, beneath stacks of corporate reports, lay a leather case he hadn't touched in over a decade. The leather was cracked with age, but the brass clasps still gleamed dully. Sienna's initials were embossed in the corner, the letters worn smooth from years of handling. Back at the dining table, he opened the case with reverent care. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, lay Sienna's violin repair tools. Each implement was exactly as she'd left it. The small screwdrivers, the specialized files, the delicate brushes for applying rosin. The familiar scent of wood polish and violin strings wafted up, bringing with it a rush of memories he'd spent years trying to suppress. Beside the tools lay Sienna's maintenance diary, its pages dog-eared and filled with her neat handwriting. Vincent opened it slowly, careful not to damage the fragile spine. His daughter had documented everything about this violin. Every string change, every minor adjustment, every detail that made it sing perfectly. Bridge height adjusted 2 millimeters, he read aloud, his finger tracing Sienna's precise notes. New A-string tension set to. His voice caught as he recognized the date, just weeks before she died. With trembling fingers, he began to disassemble the violin, following Sienna's documented process step by step. The bridge came off first, revealing years of wear underneath. He cleaned each part carefully, using the same gentle motions he'd watched Sienna perform countless times during her practice sessions. As he worked, he couldn't help but marvel at Alara's intuitive care of the instrument. Despite having no formal training, she had somehow known exactly where to support the weakened areas. The medical tape she'd used to stabilize the loose string was placed precisely where Sienna's notes indicated the most stress would occur. "You understood him," Vincent whispered, thinking of how Alara spoke to Mr. Squeak as a friend. "You knew exactly what he needed." He worked methodically through the night, losing track of time as he immersed himself in this intimate task. The dining room's shadows lengthened and shifted, but he barely noticed, focused entirely on the delicate work before him. When he reached for the frayed G-string, it snapped at his touch, the aged material finally giving way. Vincent sat back, holding the broken string in his palm. This wasn't just any string. This was one of the originals Sienna had chosen herself. His eyes returned to the leather case. In a small velvet pouch tucked into a corner lay something he'd almost forgotten about. With shaking hands, he withdrew a carefully preserved violin string unlike any other. Thin, almost translucent with a peculiar sheen. This string had been Sienna's final project, her attempt to create something unique for her last recital. She had taken strands of her own hair, learning an ancient technique to braid them into a viable violin string. The process had taken weeks, and she'd been so proud of the result. She'd planned to use it in her final performance, the one Vincent had missed. Now he held this piece of Sienna, this physical connection to her creativity and passion, and knew exactly where it belonged. With painstaking care, he installed the hair string in place of the broken one, adjusting the tension precisely according to Sienna's notes. Hours passed as Vincent restored each element of the violin. He cleaned every curve, polished every surface, tightened every fitting. His corporate empire could have crumbled in those hours, and he wouldn't have noticed or cared. This work, this act of restoration felt more important than any business deal he'd ever closed. Finally, as the first hints of dawn began to color the sky outside, Vincent set down his tools. Before him lay the violin, transformed. The wood gleamed warmly in the lamplight, its surface still bearing the marks of its history but now protected and preserved. The strings, including Sienna's special creation, stretched taut and true across the bridge. Even the scroll, once chipped and dull, now curved gracefully upward as if reaching for music yet to be played. Vincent rested his hands on the finished work, feeling the smooth wood beneath his palms. The violin seemed to pulse with potential energy, like a living thing waiting to sing again. In the quiet of the early morning, he could almost imagine he heard echoes of Sienna's playing, mingled with Alara's humming. "I'll make it right this time," he whispered softly, his words barely disturbing the pre-dawn stillness. The promise felt heavy and real in the air, weighted with all the years of silence and regret that had led to this moment. The morning sun filtered through the hospital windows, casting long rectangles of light across the linoleum floor. Vincent walked through the pediatric ward carrying a polished violin case, his footsteps measured and deliberate. His usual tailored suit was replaced with a simple button-down shirt and slacks, an outfit that felt more appropriate for what he was about to do. He found Alara exactly where she had been yesterday, sitting in her wheelchair by the window. Her small hands moved across paper napkins from the cafeteria, drawing musical notes with careful precision despite her bandaged fingers. The morning light caught her face, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes that spoke of another restless night. When she looked up and saw Vincent, her whole face brightened. "You came back!" she exclaimed, her voice carrying both surprise and joy. She quickly gathered her napkin compositions, stacking them neatly on her lap. "I was just writing some songs for Mr. Squeak for when he feels better." Vincent pulled up a chair beside her, setting the violin case carefully on a nearby table. "About that," he said softly, his hands resting on the leather case. "I have something to show you." Alara's eyes widened as she recognized the case, different from the worn cardboard box she'd been keeping her violin in. She wheeled herself closer, paper napkins floating to the floor forgotten. With deliberate movements, Vincent unlatched the case. The familiar scent of wood polish and rosin filled the air between them. He opened it slowly, revealing the restored violin nestled in dark velvet. "Mr. Squeak's ready to sing," Vincent said, his voice barely above a whisper. Alara's hands trembled as she reached for the violin. Vincent helped her lift it from its case, watching as she cradled it like something precious and alive. Her fingers traced the smooth wood, lingering over the places where scratches had been carefully filled and polished. The new strings gleamed in the morning light, especially the unique one that held a piece of Sienna's legacy. She positioned the violin under her chin, a movement that seemed as natural as breathing despite her condition. When she drew the bow across the strings, the pure, clear note that emerged made her gasp. It wasn't the weak, scratchy sound she'd grown used to. This was different, rich and warm, almost otherworldly in its clarity. Tears welled in her eyes as she hugged the violin to her chest. "He missed me," she whispered into the wood, as if sharing a secret with an old friend. There were no questions about how the violin had been fixed or why Vincent had done it. In Alara's world, this kind of magic needed no explanation. Vincent felt something shift in his chest as he watched her. The wall he'd built around his heart over the years developed another crack, joining the ones Alara had already created with her paper flowers and simple truths. They spent the morning together, Alara playing snippets of melodies she'd learned by ear. Her technique was raw, but her intuition was remarkable. She played the way birds sing, naturally, joyfully, without concern for formal training or proper form. When lunch arrived, Vincent stayed. The hospital food came on plastic trays, nothing like the gourmet meals he was used to, but he found himself sharing chicken nuggets and green jello with Alara as she told him stories about Mr. Squeak's adventures. Throughout their meal, nurses came and went. They seemed surprised to see Vincent there, but pleased. One of them, an older woman with kind eyes, pulled him aside while Alara was distracted with her dessert. "It's good to see her with a visitor," the nurse said quietly. "She hasn't had anyone regular since—" She trailed off, but Vincent understood. Since her mother died. Since the system failed her. Another nurse joined them, adding in a hushed tone, "Most of her medical team volunteers extra time with her when they can. She's special, that one, but she needs more than we can give her." Vincent nodded, watching as Alara hummed to herself, conducting an imaginary orchestra with her spoon. The nurse's words confirmed what he'd already decided last night while restoring the violin. He couldn't walk away from this, not again. That evening, after promising Alara he would return tomorrow, Vincent sat in his office high above the city. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He had his legal team on speakerphone, their voices filling the room with cautious concern. "Mr. Hale," his head lawyer began, "we've reviewed the situation. Pursuing guardianship in this case would be complicated. Alara is classified as terminally non-adoptable due to her condition." Another voice chimed in. "The requirements are extensive. You'd need to prove emotional fitness, which, given your limited experience with children since Miss Sienna, could be challenging. Then there's medical clearance, proof of long-term care capability. The success rate for cases like this is virtually zero," a third lawyer added. "The system isn't designed to place children with her needs in private homes. It's meant to maintain them in medical facilities until—" Vincent cut them off with a sharp gesture, even though they couldn't see it. He walked out onto his penthouse balcony, phone still in hand. The city stretched out before him, a maze of lights and shadows. In one of those lights was a hospital room where a little girl was probably playing her restored violin, unaware that the system had already decided her fate. The same system that had failed her mother, the same system he had once been complicit in maintaining. Looking out over the city he had helped build, Vincent spoke quietly but with absolute certainty. "Then I'll change the law." His words hung in the night air, carrying the weight of a promise. The lawyers on the phone fell silent, perhaps recognizing the tone their client used when he'd made an irrevocable decision. It was the same tone that had built his empire, but this time it wasn't about business deals or profit margins. This was about redemption, about finally doing what Sienna would have wanted him to do, using his power to help someone who needed it most. The following afternoon, Vincent arrived at the hospital carrying 2 bags. The first contained a compact electronic keyboard, its keys small enough for Ilara's delicate hands. The second held a leather-bound music notebook with crisp, empty pages waiting to be filled. Ilara's eyes lit up when she saw him enter. She was sitting up in bed today, her violin carefully propped on a pillow beside her. The morning sunlight streamed through the window, catching the dust motes that danced around her like tiny stars. "What's in the bags?" she asked, trying to peer inside as Vincent set them down. Her curiosity made her lean forward, IV tubes swaying gently with her movement. Vincent carefully unpacked the keyboard first, setting it up on her bedside table. When he revealed the notebook, Ilara squealed with such pure joy that a nurse poked her head in to check on them. The sound seemed to surprise Vincent, too. It was the kind of unbridled happiness he hadn't heard in years. "Can we make music together?" Ilara asked, her small fingers already reaching for the keyboard's pristine keys. Vincent nodded, pulling up his usual chair. "I thought we could try something new," he said, opening the notebook to its first blank page. "You can create the music, and I'll help write it down properly." Ilara's face scrunched up in concentration. "But I don't know how to write music. My notes look like little stick people having a party." A slight smile tugged at Vincent's lips. "Show me," he encouraged, handing her a pencil. Ilara began to hum, a sweet, simple melody that seemed to float in the air between them. As she hummed, she drew her stick figure notes, some with happy faces, others with little hats or umbrellas. Vincent watched, fascinated, as she created her own musical language. "This one's jumping because it's excited," she explained, pointing to a particularly energetic stick figure. "And these ones are holding hands because they're best friends and need to be played together." Vincent began translating her unique notation into proper musical notes on the facing page. He showed her how her jumping stick figure became a staccato note, and how her holding hands figures transformed into connected eighth notes. Their collaboration turned into a game. Ilara would hum a phrase and draw her stick people, then Vincent would play it back on the keyboard using proper notation. Sometimes she'd giggle and say, No, that stick person is definitely more bouncy than that." And they'd try again until the music matched her vision. Hours passed this way, the sunlight shifting across the room as morning turned to afternoon. Nurses came and went, smiling at the unlikely duo, the small girl in her hospital gown and the distinguished businessman, heads bent together over a notebook filled with dancing stick figures and flowing musical notes. As the afternoon light began to soften, Ilara started humming a new melody. It was different from her previous compositions, more complex, with an underlying melancholy that seemed beyond her years. Vincent's hands froze over the keyboard. The melody was hauntingly familiar. His heart began to race as he recognized the tune. It was the beginning of Sienna's unfinished composition, the one she had been working on days before the accident. He had found the handwritten draft in her room afterward, the final measures trailing off into blank space, forever incomplete. "Ilara," he said carefully, his voice barely steady, "where did you learn that song?" She looked up at him, surprised by his tone. "I didn't learn it. I heard it in my dream last night. There was a pretty lady playing it on a big piano, but she couldn't finish it. She looked sad." Vincent's hands trembled as he reached into his briefcase. He pulled out a worn folder containing Sienna's original sheet music, protected in a clear sleeve. The paper was slightly yellowed now, the pencil marks faded but still visible. He placed it on the bed beside Ilara's stick figure notes. She studied it with intense concentration, her small finger tracing the lines of music. Suddenly, she pointed to a blank section near the end. "This part was missing," she said matter-of-factly, "but I heard it in my dream." Without hesitation, she began to hum again, picking up exactly where Sienna's notation had stopped. Vincent felt tears forming in his eyes as he quickly transcribed what Ilara was humming. The melody fit perfectly with what Sienna had written, as if the two pieces had always been meant to find each other across time. "What should we call this piece?" Vincent asked softly, once they had pieced together the entire composition. Ilara thought for a moment, her head tilted to one side. "The bridge," she declared finally. "Why the bridge?" "Because," she said, her voice carrying that simple wisdom that often made Vincent forget she was only 8. "It sounds like two people trying to meet in the middle." They worked well past visiting hours, Vincent using his foundation's authority to stay late. Together they refined the piece, Ilara humming corrections when Vincent's transcription didn't quite capture the emotion she felt in her dream. The hospital grew quiet around them as night fell. The overhead lights buzzed softly, creating a cocoon of warmth in the otherwise silent ward. Finally, when Ilara's eyes began to droop, Vincent carefully packed up their materials. He walked through the empty hospital corridors, the completed sheet music clutched in his hand. The night air hit his face as he stepped outside, but he barely noticed the cold. The city stretched out before him, its usual cacophony of sounds somehow muted, as if in reverence to what had just happened. Standing there, sheet music in hand and tears in his eyes, Vincent felt the weight of the moment. Somehow, across years and loss and grief, his daughter's final piece had found its way to completion through the dreams of a little girl who needed him as much as he needed her. A week had passed since the completion of Sienna's song. The morning sun cast long shadows through the hospital windows as Vincent strode down the pediatric ward's corridor, a thick folder tucked under his arm. His footsteps echoed with purpose against the linoleum floor, and for once he didn't mind the antiseptic smell that permeated the air. Several nurses waved as he passed. They'd grown used to his daily visits. One even called out, "She's been asking for you since breakfast." Vincent nodded, allowing himself a small smile. The fact that someone actually looked forward to seeing him still felt foreign but warming. When he entered Ilara's room, she was sitting cross-legged on her bed, surrounded by a fortress of paper cranes. She'd been folding them from old sheet music, creating what she called her musical bird army. Her face brightened when she saw him. "You're late today," she said, pretending to scold him while carefully moving her paper birds to make space. "I had an important meeting," Vincent replied, pulling up his usual chair. "Actually, that's why I'm here. I have something to show you." He opened the folder and spread several large architectural drawings across her bed. The papers showed detailed floor plans, garden layouts, and colorful 3D renderings of a building that looked nothing like a hospital. "What is it?" Ilara asked, leaning forward to examine the drawings. Her thin fingers traced the lines of a circular room filled with instruments. "This," Vincent said, his voice soft but proud, "is Sienna's house. It's going to be a special place for children who love music, just like you. Children who need extra care but deserve more than just hospital rooms." He pointed to different areas in the drawings. "See here? This is the main music room with windows from floor to ceiling. And this is the recording studio where kids can make their own albums." His finger moved to another section. "These are the bedrooms. Each one has its own practice space and a view of the gardens." Ilara's eyes widened as she studied the garden plans. Is that a violin?" Vincent nodded. "The whole garden is shaped like a violin when viewed from above. There will be paths that follow the strings, and the flower beds will form the body. In spring, everything will bloom in different shades of purple, Sienna's favorite color." He watched as Ilara traced the garden's outline with her finger, her expression unreadable. Then he took a deep breath and said, "And you, Ilara, will be our very first resident." The silence that followed wasn't what he expected. Ilara's hand stopped moving across the paper, and she slowly sat back against her pillows. Her paper cranes rustled softly as she shifted. "I don't want to go," she said quietly, not meeting his eyes. Vincent felt as if someone had knocked the wind out of him. "What? But I thought—" He trailed off, watching her small face carefully. Ilara pulled her knees up to her chest, making herself even smaller. "If I live somewhere nice," she whispered, "I might stop missing my mommy, and she's all I had left." Vincent's throat tightened as she continued, her voice barely audible now. "Every time grown-ups give me hope, they leave. First, Daddy went to heaven. Then Mommy went to jail and never came back. Then the nice foster lady got sick. Then the group home said they couldn't help anymore. She looked up at him finally, her eyes glistening. I get moved and moved and moved, and every time someone says it's going to be better, it gets worse. Vincent sat very still, letting her words sink in. He thought about all the times he'd used his wealth to fix problems, how he'd assumed that better facilities and more resources would automatically mean a better life. But here was this 8-year-old girl teaching him that sometimes the grandest gestures could feel like the scariest threats. He understood now. She wasn't afraid of pain or discomfort. She was afraid of happiness. Because in her experience, happiness was always temporary, always followed by loss. The hospital, with its sterile walls and routine procedures, at least felt predictable, safe. The architectural plans suddenly seemed overwhelming on her small bed. Vincent began to gather them up slowly, giving her time to process. He thought about Sienna, about how she would have handled this moment. His daughter had always known how to listen, really listen to what people weren't saying. Instead of arguing or trying to convince her, Vincent simply folded the plans and put them back in his folder. Then he looked at Alara and said softly, "Then I'll wait. Until you say it's time." The tension in Alara's small shoulders eased slightly. She reached under her pillow and pulled out a piece of paper, carefully folded in quarters. "I made this for you," she said, handing it to him. Vincent unfolded it gently. It was a crayon drawing, simple but touching. 3 figures stood beneath an arched bridge: a tall man in a suit, a small girl in what looked like a princess dress, and between them, propped up like a person, was a violin with a smiling face. The bridge above them was made of musical notes that curved and danced across the page. He looked at the drawing for a long moment, understanding its meaning without needing to ask. The bridge wasn't just the one from their song. It was the space between them, the careful distance Alara needed to maintain until she felt safe enough to cross it. Alara watched him study the picture, then reached out and touched the violin in the drawing. "That's Mr. Squeak," she said. "He's happy because he gets to be with both of us." Vincent carefully tucked the drawing into his folder, next to the plans for Sienna's house. The future could wait. For now, what mattered most was being present, being constant, proving to this brave little girl that not everyone leaves. They sat together in comfortable silence as morning turned to afternoon. Alara returning to her paper cranes, Vincent watching her fold each one with careful precision. Neither felt the need to speak about what had passed between them. The understanding was there, floating in the air like one of Alara's musical birds, waiting for its own time to land. The morning sun painted warm rectangles across the hospital corridor as Vincent made his way to Alara's room, carefully balancing a white paper bag and 2 small cups. The aroma of fresh-baked pastries and rich cocoa followed him, drawing curious glances from the nursing staff. He found Alara already awake, sitting up in bed and drawing musical notes on her latest batch of paper napkins. Her face broke into a wide smile when she saw him, her eyes immediately fixing on the treats in his hands. "Is that chocolate I smell?" she asked, sniffing the air dramatically. Vincent nodded, setting the items down on her bedside table. "Hot cocoa and fresh pastries from the French bakery downtown. I thought we could use a special breakfast today." Alara's eyes widened as she peered into the paper bag. They looked like tiny clouds made of sugar. She pulled out a perfectly flaky croissant, examining it from all angles before taking a delicate bite. "We should have a proper picnic," she declared suddenly, brushing crumbs from her hospital gown. "A music picnic? Can we go to the playroom? The one with the big window?" Vincent glanced at the nurse who had just entered to check Alara's morning vitals. The nurse smiled and nodded. "The playroom's empty right now. I can wheel her down there if you'd like." "Yes, please." Alara clutched her precious violin case to her chest while the nurse helped her into her wheelchair. Vincent gathered their breakfast provisions and followed them down the hallway. The hospital's playroom was bathed in morning light from floor-to-ceiling windows. Colorful murals of jungle animals decorated the walls, and soft playmats covered the floor. The nurse positioned Alara's wheelchair near the window, where sunbeams wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Vincent spread a clean hospital blanket on the floor beside her wheelchair, arranging their breakfast like a proper picnic. He placed the pastries on napkins and handed Alara her cocoa in a small cup with a bendy straw. "Now it's perfect," Alara announced, taking a careful sip. A tiny chocolate mustache appeared above her lip, making Vincent smile. She insisted on holding Mr. Squeak while she ate, the violin resting across her lap like a faithful pet. Between bites of pastry, she began humming a playful tune. "That's new," Vincent observed, pulling out his notebook to capture the melody. "It's the pastry waltz," Alara declared with a giggle. "Listen, this part goes, croissant, croissant, chocolate swirl," she sang, matching the words to her tune. "And this part is for when the sugar makes you want to dance." Vincent transcribed her composition, adding proper musical notation to her spontaneous creation. They spent the next hour crafting silly songs about breakfast foods, each one making Alara laugh harder than the last. Her giggles echoed through the playroom, drawing smiles from passing hospital staff. She was in the middle of composing the Muffin March when a nurse appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Harrison would like to discuss your latest scans with us, sweetheart," she said gently. The change in Alara was immediate and profound. Her shoulders tensed and the laughter vanished from her face, replaced by a blank mask that looked wrong on her young features. She clutched Mr. Squeak tighter, her knuckles white against the polished wood. Vincent recognized the fear in her eyes. It was the same look she'd had when discussing Sienna's house. He reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "Would you like me to stay with you?" She shook her head quickly, still not speaking. The nurse wheeled her away, leaving Vincent alone in the suddenly quiet playroom, their half-eaten breakfast growing cold in the sunlight. That evening, after making sure Alara was settled with her dinner, Vincent met with Dr. Harrison in his office. The physician's face was grave as he pulled up Alara's latest test results on his computer screen. "Her lung function is declining," Dr. Harrison explained, pointing to various charts and graphs. "The spinal muscular atrophy is affecting her respiratory muscles more severely than we'd hoped. We're seeing a steady decrease in capacity." Vincent leaned forward, studying the numbers, though they meant little to him. "How long?" he asked, his voice rough. The doctor sighed. "It's impossible to give an exact timeline. The progression varies from patient to patient. But," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "we're looking at months rather than years. There's no cure for SMA, Mr. Hale. All we can do is manage her symptoms and try to make her comfortable." Vincent sat back in his chair, feeling the weight of the doctor's words settle over him like a heavy cloak. He thought of Alara's laughter from that morning, of her silly songs and chocolate-stained smile. How could something so vibrant be slipping away so quietly? "What about experimental treatments?" he asked. "Research programs?" "There must be something." Dr. Harrison shook his head. "We've explored every option. Her case is too advanced for most trials, and her overall health is too fragile for experimental procedures." He looked at Vincent with sympathy. "The best thing we can do now is focus on quality of life. Give her good days. Make memories." Vincent nodded mechanically, thanked the doctor, and left the office. His feet carried him back to Alara's room without conscious thought. The pediatric ward was quiet now, most of its young patients already asleep. Alara's room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of monitoring equipment. She had fallen asleep with Mr. Squeak tucked beside her like a teddy bear, one small hand still resting on its strings. Her latest composition sheet lay on the bedside table, the pastry waltz from their morning picnic, covered in her creative doodles and Vincent's careful notations. He sank into the chair beside her bed, picking up the sheet of music. In the quiet of the hospital night, he studied her childish scrawls, the way she drew extra loops on her quarter notes and gave each rest mark a smiling face. His fingers tightened on the paper as he whispered into the darkness, "Then we'll make time sing." The construction crew arrived early on Monday morning, their trucks and equipment rolling up the quiet hilltop as the sun rose over the city. Vincent stood at the site, blueprints in hand, watching as the first orange safety fences went up around what would become Sienna's house. The location was perfect, close enough to the hospital for emergency access, but far enough away to feel like an escape. He walked the perimeter slowly, pausing at each marker that outlined the future building. Here would be the main entrance, with its wide, wheelchair-accessible ramps. There, the music room's foundation would be laid, designed with perfect acoustics and large windows to let in natural light. The garden would spiral out from the center in the shape of a violin, with paths wide enough for wheelchairs and medical equipment. Throughout the week, Vincent split his time between the hospital and the construction site. He arrived at the hilltop each morning before dawn, reviewing plans and making adjustments. Every detail had to be perfect. He chose materials himself: warm, natural woods for the music room floors, soft-touch fabrics for the common areas, and special soundproofing panels that would allow music to flow through the halls without disturbing resting patients. In Ilara's future room, he spent hours with the interior designer, selecting exactly the right shade of violet paint. Not too dark, not too pale. It had to match the way she described the color of twilight when she played her evening songs. The windows were positioned to catch both morning and afternoon light, and he insisted on a window seat wide enough to hold her wheelchair comfortably. The foundation work progressed quickly. Vincent watched as concrete was poured, steel beams were positioned, and the first rows of bricks began to rise from the earth. The crew worked efficiently, but he checked every detail personally. When they laid the first stone of the garden path, he had them pause. He pulled out a small piece of paper with carefully printed letters and handed it to the stonemason. "This needs to be carved here," he said, pointing to the stone. "Ilara's step." The mason nodded, and Vincent watched as each letter was carefully etched into the smooth surface. When it was done, he ran his fingers over the inscription, feeling each curve and line. This would be her first step toward a new home, whether she was ready to take it yet or not. Throughout the week, he documented everything with his phone camera. He captured the sunrise over the construction site, the first walls going up, the special acoustic tiles being installed in the music room. He took detailed photos of Ilara's room as it began to take shape, and close-ups of her name carved in the garden stone. The following afternoon, Vincent arrived at the hospital with a tablet full of construction photos. He found Ilara in her usual spot by the window, Mr. Squeak, resting in her lap as she hummed softly to herself. Her face brightened when she saw him, though he noticed the dark circles under her eyes. She hadn't been sleeping well. "I brought something to show you," he said, pulling up a chair beside her wheelchair. He held out the tablet and she leaned forward curiously. Vincent scrolled through the photos slowly, explaining each one. "This is where the front door will be," he said, showing her the foundation outline. "And here's the music room. See how the windows will catch the light." Ilara's fingers hovered over the screen, not quite touching it. Her expression was guarded, but Vincent caught the flash of wonder in her eyes as he showed her more details. "The garden paths are being laid now," he continued, showing her the winding design. "And look, this stone here has something special on it." He zoomed in on the photo of her carved name. Ilara's breath caught slightly as she read the inscription. "Ilara's step," she whispered, tracing the letters on the screen with one finger. "It's the very first stone in the path," Vincent explained. "Nobody can enter the garden without crossing your step first." She was quiet for a long moment, studying the photo. Then she looked up at the next image, her future room, with its violet walls beginning to take shape. "It looks like..." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Like a place where the sky listens." Her voice was soft, almost wondering. Vincent smiled. "That's exactly what we wanted it to be." They continued through the photos, Ilara asking questions about small details, where the piano would go, if there would be birds in the garden, whether other kids could bring their own instruments. Her curiosity grew with each image, though she still maintained a careful distance in her comments, always speaking about it as something far away, something for someday. Later that afternoon, while Vincent was meeting with her doctors, Ilara asked a nurse for her art supplies. When he returned, she handed him a carefully folded piece of paper. It was a crayon drawing of the garden, complete with flowers and music notes floating in the air. In one corner, in her wobbly handwriting, she had written, "Maybe I'll go see it one day." Vincent tucked the drawing carefully into his jacket pocket, next to his heart. That evening, after leaving the hospital, he didn't go straight home to his penthouse as usual. Instead, he found himself driving to his main residence, the sprawling mansion he rarely visited anymore. The house was dark and silent as he made his way up the grand staircase to the second floor. Sienna's bedroom door was closed, as it had been for years. He turned the handle slowly, letting the door swing open into the untouched space. Everything was exactly as she had left it. The sheet music still open on the stand, her violin bow lying across the desk, the grand piano waiting patiently in the corner. Vincent crossed the room and sat at the piano bench. Dust had settled on the keys, but when he pressed one experimentally, the note rang true and clear. He pulled Sienna's unfinished composition from his briefcase. The bridge, now complete with Alara's additions carefully transcribed into the empty measures. His fingers found the opening notes hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence. The melody flowed through the quiet room, no longer broken or incomplete. Where there had been silence, there was now resolution. Where there had been emptiness, there was harmony. For the first time since he discovered the piece among Sienna's belongings, it felt whole. The music bridged the gap between memory and present, between loss and hope, between what was broken and what could be mended. Vincent sat in his home office late into the night, surrounded by stacks of legal documents, medical records, and carefully prepared testimonials. His normally pristine desk was covered in highlighted papers and sticky notes, each one representing another piece of the complex puzzle he was trying to solve. The soft glow of his desk lamp cast shadows across the files spread before him, including a thick folder labeled Guardianship Application Alara Esteban. He had spent weeks preparing for this moment. Every detail was meticulously organized, financial statements showing his ability to provide comprehensive medical care, letters of recommendation from hospital staff, documentation of his visits and their musical sessions together, even architectural plans for Sienna's house, demonstrating his long-term commitment to children's care. The morning of the meeting arrived with golden sunlight streaming through the windows of his penthouse. Vincent dressed with particular care, choosing a charcoal gray suit that projected both authority and approachability. He tucked Alara's latest crayon drawing into his breast pocket, a small reminder of why he was doing this. The sleek boardroom at the Department of Child Services gleamed with polished wood and chrome. Vincent's legal team had arrived early to set up their presentation materials. Charts and graphs lined the walls, showing projected care costs, medical provisions, and educational plans. Everything was in order, every possible question anticipated and answered. The Child Services officer, Ms. Blackwood, entered precisely on time. She was a stern-faced woman in her 50s, carrying a worn leather briefcase that had clearly seen many similar meetings. Behind her came 2 additional caseworkers and a state-appointed child advocate. Their expressions were professionally neutral as they took their seats across the long table. Vincent's lead attorney, James Chen, began the presentation with practiced confidence. He outlined Vincent's extensive resources, the specialized medical facilities being built, and the comprehensive care plan they had developed with Alara's doctors. The support letters from hospital staff were particularly moving. Detailed accounts of Vincent's daily visits, the positive changes in Alara's demeanor, and the therapeutic value of their musical connection. Mr. Hale has demonstrated not only the financial means, Chen concluded, but also the emotional investment and commitment necessary to provide Alara with the best possible care environment. Vincent leaned forward slightly, hands clasped on the table. He had rehearsed his own part carefully, personal but professional, emotional but controlled. "I understand this is an unusual situation," he began, "but Alara's case is unique. She needs specialized care that combines medical support with creative enrichment. We've already seen how music therapy has improved her quality of life." Ms. Blackwood had been silent throughout the presentation, making occasional notes in her file. Now she looked up, her gray eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Hale," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, "your preparation is impressive. However, there are several concerns we must address." She opened her briefcase and removed a thick file. "Ilara's medical classification is terminal non-adoptable," she stated flatly. "This designation exists specifically to prevent emotional attachments that could complicate end-of-life care decisions." Vincent felt his chest tighten but kept his expression neutral. "We're fully aware of her condition," he replied. "That's precisely why we've developed such a comprehensive care plan." Furthermore, Ms. Blackwood continued as if he hadn't spoken, "You have no psychological clearance for parenting a child with terminal illness, no grief counseling history, no formal training in pediatric care." She glanced at another document. "In fact, your own history suggests this application may be motivated more by personal guilt than genuine parental interest." The room grew very still. Vincent could feel his legal team tensing beside him, ready to object. "The timing of this application," Ms. Blackwood went on, "coming so soon after discovering Ilara's connection to your late daughter, raises red flags. We have to consider whether this is an attempt at emotional compensation rather than a genuine desire to provide guardianship." Vincent's hands tightened beneath the table, but his voice remained steady. "My motivation is to give Ilara the best possible quality of life, regardless of its duration." The child advocate spoke up for the first time. "Mr. Hale, your resources are impressive, and your intentions appear sincere. But guardianship is about more than providing facilities and care. It's about emotional stability and long-term commitment, particularly in cases involving terminal illness." Ms. Blackwood closed her file with a decisive motion. "The department's decision is to deny temporary guardianship at this time." Her voice softened slightly, showing a hint of genuine sympathy. "You can care, Mr. Hale, but you can't claim." Vincent sat very still, absorbing the words. Years of business negotiations had taught him when to argue and when to step back. This was a moment for the latter. He reached up and straightened his tie, a gesture that helped him maintain composure. "Then I'll build something better than claiming," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction. The meeting concluded shortly after with polite but firm handshakes all around. Vincent's legal team began gathering their materials, already discussing appeal options, but he barely heard them. He walked out of the building alone, stepping into the gray afternoon. Rain had started falling while they were inside, turning the city streets slick and dark. Vincent stood for a moment under the building's overhang, watching the drops create ripples and puddles forming on the sidewalk. Then he stepped out into it, letting the rain soak through his expensive suit as he walked to his waiting car. The driver hurried to open the door, but Vincent paused before getting in. The rain ran down his face, mixing with emotions he wouldn't let show inside the boardroom. Finally, he slid into the back seat, water dripping from his clothes onto the leather. In the privacy of the car, Vincent looked down at his hands, the same hands that had fixed Ilara's violin, that had transcribed her music, that had held her small drawings. He spoke softly, barely above a whisper. "She doesn't need a parent. She needs a future." The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital's rooftop garden as Vincent carefully helped the nurses wheel Ilara's chair through the doorway. Her oxygen tank hummed quietly, its familiar rhythm mixing with the gentle autumn breeze. The nurses had wrapped her in a soft purple blanket, protecting her from the cooling air, and Mr. Squeak rested securely in her lap. Vincent had spent the morning preparing the space, setting up a modern electric fire pit that cast a warm, dancing glow without any smoke that might irritate Ilara's sensitive lungs. String lights twinkled overhead, creating a gentle canopy of stars even before darkness fell. Comfortable chairs surrounded the fire pit, and a small keyboard stood ready on a portable stand. "It's like a magic castle up here," Ilara whispered, her eyes wide as she took in the transformation. The usual stark hospital rooftop had become something ethereal. Potted plants created natural barriers against the wind, and cushions softened the institutional metal chairs. Even her wheelchair seemed less medical somehow, decorated with fairy lights that matched the ones overhead. The nurses helped position her chair perfectly, checking her oxygen levels and adjusting her blanket before stepping back. "We'll be just inside if you need anything," one of them said with a warm smile, clearly touched by the effort Vincent had put into creating this moment. As the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, Vincent settled into the chair beside Alara. The electric fire pit cast shifting patterns of light across their faces, making the moment feel somehow both real and dreamlike at once. "The city looks different from up here," Alara observed, her small face turned toward the horizon where skyscrapers caught the fading sunlight. "Like it's made of gold." Vincent nodded, watching how the light played across her features. Despite her illness, there was always something bright in her expression, something that reminded him so much of Sienna. "Sometimes we need to climb higher to see things differently," he said softly. As the sky deepened into rich blues and purples, Alara lifted her violin from its case. Her movements were careful, reverent, as she positioned it against her shoulder. The nurses had helped her put on fingerless gloves earlier, protecting her sensitive fingers from the cooling air, while still allowing her to feel the strings. The first notes were tentative, like questions floating on the evening breeze. Vincent recognized something in the melody, fragments of Sienna's unfinished piece, but different somehow. Alara wasn't just playing the notes, she was reaching through them, searching for something. Vincent moved quietly to the keyboard, turning it on with the volume low. He waited, listening as Alara's melody took shape. There was Sienna's theme, the one she had written in those final days, but Alara was weaving something new around it, a companion piece, a response to the original notes. Carefully, Vincent began to play, adding gentle chords beneath Alara's melody. His fingers found the familiar progression from Sienna's composition, but he followed Alara's lead as she branched into new territory. Together, they began building something that was neither fully Sienna's nor entirely new. It was a conversation between past and present, between loss and hope. The violin sang clearer now, gaining confidence. Alara's small body swayed slightly with the music, her eyes closed in concentration. The firelight danced across Mr. Squeak's polished surface, making the wood seem to glow from within. "This part," Alara said softly, never stopping her playing. "It's where we meet again after all the sad parts." Her bow moved in long, sweet strokes, drawing out notes that seemed to reach toward the emerging stars above them. Vincent's accompaniment followed her lead, supporting but never overwhelming her melody. He understood what she meant. This wasn't just music anymore. It was a bridge across time, across loss, across all the spaces between people who loved each other but couldn't stay together. The city lights began twinkling below them as true darkness settled in. The electric fire pit cast its warm glow higher now, creating a gentle circle of light around them as they played. Their breath made small clouds in the cooling air, but neither seemed to notice the temperature. As their impromptu duet drew to a natural close, Alara leaned her head against Vincent's shoulder. The simple gesture carried more weight than any words could have. "You know," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the breeze, "I think Mr. Squeak likes being up here. I think he likes you, too." Vincent felt something warm and profound settle in his chest. Not the sharp pain of grief he'd carried for so long, but something softer, something healing. He smiled, genuine and unguarded. "I like him back," he replied gently. "And I like you, Alara. Very much." The wind picked up slightly, rustling through the potted plants around them. The firelight flickered, casting dancing shadows on their faces. Without speaking, they began to play again, letting their music rise up toward the emerging stars. The melody of the bridge floated out over the city, carrying with it all the words they didn't need to say. The morning light filtered through the hospital's wide windows, casting long rectangles of warmth across the sterile hallway where Vincent stood. He held a carefully wrapped box in his hands, its silver paper catching the sunlight. The weight of it felt significant, not just in his hands but in what it represented. He'd arrived earlier than usual, his anticipation making it impossible to wait any longer. The sound of wheels on linoleum made him look up. Alara was being pushed down the hallway by her morning nurse, her small frame wrapped in a new lavender sweater. Her face brightened when she spotted Vincent, and a mischievous smile played across her lips. "You're early," she called out, her voice carrying its usual playful lilt despite the early hour. Did Mr. Squeak send for backup? Vincent couldn't help but smile at her teasing. The nurses had grown used to seeing him there every day, and some even gave him knowing looks as they passed. He'd become as much a fixture in the pediatric wing as the colorful murals on the walls. Maybe he did, Vincent replied, falling into step beside her wheelchair as the nurse guided them toward the sunroom where they usually spent their mornings. He's very particular about timing. The nurse helped position Ilara's chair near the window, checking her oxygen levels with practiced efficiency before leaving them to their daily ritual. Sunlight streamed through the large windows, warming the space and making the dust motes dance in the air. Vincent pulled up a chair beside her, the gift-wrapped box balanced carefully on his lap. He'd spent hours ensuring every fold was perfect, every tape line invisible. The silver paper wasn't just any paper. It had musical notes embedded in its design, visible only when the light hit it just right. "What's that?" Ilara asked, her eyes fixed on the package. Her fingers fidgeted with the edge of her sweater, a telltale sign of both excitement and nervousness. "Something special," Vincent said, his voice soft but clear. He handed her the box, watching as she carefully began to unwrap it, taking her time with each piece of tape as if preserving the paper itself was important. Inside lay a formal invitation, printed on thick cream-colored paper with gold lettering. But it wasn't just any invitation. It was a program. And there on the cover, in elegant script, were the words that made Ilara's breath catch, featuring Ilara Esteban, the girl with the gold strings. Beneath the program was a professional-looking brochure showing rendered images of Sienna's house. The music hall looked magnificent, with soaring ceilings and perfect acoustics. And there, listed as the inaugural performer for the grand opening next week, was her name again. Ilara's hands trembled slightly as she held the papers. Her eyes grew wide, then began to fill with tears. Vincent watched as emotions played across her face, joy, wonder, and then, unmistakably, fear. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'll be strong enough." Vincent leaned forward, gently taking one of her small hands in his. The contrast was striking, his large, steady hands encompassing her delicate fingers, still wrapped in their daily bandages. "Then I'll be your strength," he said simply, his voice carrying all the conviction that her uncertain one lacked. Ilara looked up at him, searching his face as if looking for any sign of doubt. Finding none, she squeezed his hand with what little strength she had. The rest of the day passed in a blur of preparation. Nurses came and went, checking vitals and adjusting medications. Vincent arranged for a comfortable reclining wheelchair to be delivered, one that would allow Ilara to perform while properly supported. He coordinated with her doctors, ensuring every precaution would be in place for the performance. As evening approached, the hospital quieted. The harsh overhead lights dimmed, replaced by the softer glow of table lamps. Ilara sat in her bed, propped up by pillows, with Mr. Squeak resting in her lap. Vincent had pulled his chair close, a music stand between them holding blank sheet music ready to be filled. The violin's voice was softer now, matching the hushed atmosphere of the night shift. Ilara played quietly, working through sections of The Bridge with careful concentration. Her oxygen machine kept its steady rhythm in the background, a metronome to their private concert. Vincent's pen moved across the paper, capturing each note as it came to life. He'd learned to read Ilara's music not just through sound, but through the way her face changed with each phrase, how her eyebrows would furrow slightly during complex passages, how her eyes would close during the most emotional parts. A night nurse poked her head in, smiling at the familiar scene. She moved quietly to dim the lights further, leaving just enough illumination for them to see their work. The small circle of light around them created an intimate space, a world of their own where music was the only language needed. Ilara paused between phrases, adjusting her fingers on the strings. "This part needs to sound like starlight," she whispered, as if speaking too loudly might break the spell of the moment. Vincent nodded, understanding perfectly what she meant. He added a note in the margin of the score, "con brillante," with brightness. But beneath it, in smaller letters, he wrote, "like starlight." They continued like this, building their bridge note by note, measure by measure. The city outside grew quiet, but in their small circle of light, the music kept flowing. Ilara's breathing was steady, measured between phrases, and Vincent's pen never stopped moving, capturing every nuance of their shared creation. The nurse returned periodically, checking Ilara's monitors with practiced silence, but she never interrupted their work. She simply adjusted the lights a little lower each time, until only the small lamp above the music stand remained, casting its gentle glow over the violin, the sheet music, and their focused faces. In this quiet space between day and night, they continued their careful work. The music they created was more than just notes on a page. It was a conversation, a promise, a bridge between what was and what could be. And in the soft lamplight, with Mr. Squeak singing quietly and Vincent's pen scratching against paper, that bridge grew stronger with every passing moment. 3 days before the grand opening of Sienna's house, Vincent stood in a small, wood-paneled workshop tucked away in the city's historic district. Afternoon light filtered through dusty windows, illuminating floating particles that smelled of fresh wood shavings and varnish. The space was cramped but immaculate, with tools arranged in precise order along the walls, and half-finished instruments hanging from the ceiling like sleeping creatures. Master Luthier Antonio Rossi, a man in his 70s with skilled hands and sharp eyes, waited patiently as Vincent carefully placed a worn black box on the workbench. The old craftsman's eyes sparkled with interest as Vincent opened it to reveal Mr. Squeak. "Ah," Antonio said softly, lifting the violin with the reverence of someone handling a sacred text. His weathered fingers traced the curves of the instrument, reading its history through touch alone. "This is no ordinary violin. A Guarneri, perhaps? Late period?" Vincent nodded. "It belonged to my daughter, Sienna. And now?" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Now it belongs to someone equally special." Antonio's eyes crinkled with understanding. He'd heard about Vincent Hale's daughter years ago. All the city's musicians had. He gestured to a worn leather chair near his workbench. "Please sit. This will take time, but you'll want to watch." For the next several hours, Vincent remained still as Antonio began his meticulous work. The master luthier first disassembled the violin with surgical precision, laying out each piece on a soft cloth. He examined the wood under a bright lamp, muttering to himself in Italian. "The body is still strong," Antonio announced, tapping the wood gently. "It remembers its music. We'll keep as much of the original as we can." Vincent watched intently as Antonio selected replacement parts from his private collection, pieces of aged maple and spruce that he'd been saving for special projects. Each new piece was carefully matched to the violin's original tone and grain pattern. The most delicate part came when Antonio began mixing the varnish. He worked with small bottles of amber liquid, adding microscopic metal flakes that caught the light like captured stars. "This is an old technique," he explained, stirring the mixture. "The masters used it to make their instruments glow under candlelight during evening concerts." Layer by layer, Antonio applied the golden varnish to the violin's surface. Each coat needed time to dry, and during these pauses, Vincent told him about Ilara, about her natural gift for music, her resilience, and how she'd kept Sienna's violin alive through pure instinct. Antonio listened while he worked, nodding occasionally. "Some people," he said softly, "are born with music in their souls. They don't need to be taught. They just need to be given a voice." As the afternoon light began to fade, Antonio reached for his finest carving tools. "Now," he said, "about that special inscription you requested." Vincent handed him a piece of paper with the words written in his precise handwriting. Antonio studied it, then selected a delicate curved blade. With the steady hands of someone who'd spent decades perfecting his craft, he began carving under the violin's chin rest. The only sound in the workshop was the soft scraping of metal against wood as Antonio formed each letter. "To my 2 daughters, who taught me how to listen." The cursive flowed like music itself, each letter connecting to the next in an unbroken line. When the carving was complete, Antonio applied a final coat of varnish over the inscription to protect it. He held the violin up to the last rays of sunlight streaming through the window. The golden surface came alive, metallic flakes dancing like stars caught in amber. "It's ready," Antonio said simply, placing the violin in a black velvet case with the gentleness of a father laying a child to sleep. Vincent stood, emotion making his throat tight. He reached for his wallet, but Antonio waved it away. "No," the old craftsman said. "This was not business. This was art. And love." He closed the case with a soft click. "Just promise me you'll bring her to play here someday." Vincent nodded, unable to speak. He clutched the violin case to his chest as if it contained his own heart and stepped out into the evening air. At the hospital, the pediatric wing was quiet except for the usual beeping of monitors and the soft squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum. Vincent found Alara in her room, drawing musical notes on her window with washable markers. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her face lighting up with its usual warmth. "You're late today," she said, trying to sound stern but failing to hide her smile. "Mr. Squeak will be cross." Vincent set the black velvet case on her bed. "I think he'll forgive me," he said softly. Alara's eyes widened as she recognized that this wasn't their usual violin case. She wheeled closer, her small hands hovering over the velvet, as if afraid to touch it. Vincent opened the case slowly and Alara's breath caught audibly. The violin lay nestled in dark velvet, its surface catching the room's fluorescent light and transforming it into something magical. Where once there had been scratches and dull wood, now there was a golden glow that seemed to come from within the instrument itself. Alara reached out tentatively, running her fingers across the violin's surface. Her touch was feather-light, tracing the curves and F-holes with wonder. When her fingers found the inscription under the chin rest, she paused, reading the words slowly. "2 daughters?" she whispered, looking up at Vincent with questions in her eyes. He nodded once, the simple gesture carrying the weight of years of grief and new hope. Alara hugged the violin to her chest, careful despite her excitement. "Then I'll play for her too," she said softly, her voice full of promise. The moment hung between them, filled with unspoken understanding. Through the hospital window, the first stars of evening were beginning to appear, their light reflecting off the violin's golden surface like distant echoes of music yet to be played. The morning of the opening ceremony dawned bright, sunlight streaming through Sienna's house windows. The modern building stood on its hilltop, softened by ivy and winding garden paths. Inside, staff made final preparations in the state-of-the-art music hall. Vincent arrived early, checking every detail personally. He tested the railings, medical equipment built into walls, and ensured perfect temperature. Amber lights made the grand piano gleam like gold. The hall was a masterpiece of acoustic engineering and medical consideration. Its ceiling curved like a sound wave, while quiet filtration systems ensured safety for compromised immune systems. The front row accommodated wheelchairs and medical beds with power outlets and oxygen hookups. Families arrived with children using various medical devices. Despite their physical limitations, their eyes held wonder as they entered. In a preparation room, Alara sat while a nurse helped her into a light white dress chosen not to interfere with her medical equipment. Her hair was arranged with small flowers, making her look like a young conductor. "Are you nervous?" the nurse asked, adjusting Alara's IV. "Mr. Squeak isn't nervous," she replied, glancing at her golden violin. "So I'm not either." Vincent entered wearing a dark suit without his usual tie. Seeing Alara, emotion crossed his face. "You look perfect," he said roughly. Alara beamed. "Did you bring it?" Vincent nodded, producing the completed sheet music for the bridge. He placed it beside her, though they knew she wouldn't need it. As people filled the hall, Vincent checked his watch. "Remember what we practiced about breathing?" "Slow and steady like a lullaby," she recited. "And if I get tired..." "I'll be right there," Vincent finished. From backstage, Alara watched the hall fill with children in wheelchairs, medical beds, parents, medical staff, and musicians. News cameras stood discreetly in back. Vincent welcomed everyone and explained Sienna's house's mission. His voice remained steady when mentioning Sienna, though his hands tightened slightly. The nurse wheeled Alara on stage, her violin shimmering under the lights. She positioned it under her chin, took a careful breath, and began playing. The first notes of the bridge floated over the audience like morning mist. Her small fingers moved gracefully, drawing sounds that seemed too big for such a tiny musician. The piece began hesitantly before growing confident. Halfway through, Alara's breathing tightened and her bow hand shook. Without hesitation, Vincent joined her on stage, his hand covering hers on the bow as they completed the final phrases together. The last notes hung in the air before perfect silence fell. Then applause erupted, with the audience rising to their feet. Many cried openly. "I finished it," Alara said softly. "She heard us." "Yes, she did," Vincent replied, squeezing her hand. He lifted her hand, presenting her to the audience. The applause grew louder. Children in the front row beamed at her, seeing not illness but a musician who transformed weakness into strength. The golden violin gleamed under the lights, its reflections dancing as if Sienna herself was applauding with the crowd. The night settled softly over Sienna's house, bringing with it a gentle quiet that seemed to wrap around the building like a protective blanket. The newly opened facility hummed with the peaceful sounds of medical equipment and distant footsteps of night nurses making their rounds. Through large windows, moonlight painted silver paths across freshly waxed floors. In Alara's private room, everything had been arranged with careful attention to detail. Delicate musical mobiles hung from the ceiling, their metal notes and instruments catching the light as they turned slowly in the air conditioning's gentle breeze. Strings of fairy lights draped the walls in warm golden constellations, creating a dreamy atmosphere that made the medical equipment seem less intrusive. The room itself was larger than a typical hospital space, with high ceilings and large windows that would let in plenty of natural light during the day. The walls were painted in soft lavender, Alara's favorite color, and decorated with framed sheet music and artistic renderings of instruments. In one corner stood a small electronic keyboard, and beside it, a comfortable reading nook with plush pillows and a collection of music books. Vincent sat in a cushioned chair beside Alara's bed, watching as she settled in for her first night at Sienna's house. The bed itself was a special medical model, but it had been dressed with soft purple bedding and countless pillows, making it look more like a princess's bed than a hospital cot. Her oxygen equipment had been seamlessly integrated into the room's design, the tubes and monitors almost invisible against the thoughtfully planned decor. Alara lay propped up slightly, her breathing steady through her cannula. The excitement of the day's performance had tired her, but a peaceful smile still played at the corners of her mouth as she drifted between wakefulness and sleep. Her new white dress hung carefully in a nearby closet, and she wore soft pajamas decorated with musical notes. "The room is perfect," she mumbled sleepily, her eyes already half closed. "It's like sleeping inside a song." Vincent adjusted her blanket, making sure she was comfortable. "I'm glad you like it," he said softly. "Everything here is yours." "Mr. Squeaks too?" she asked, glancing at the golden violin that rested in its stand near her bed. "Mr. Squeaks too," Vincent confirmed, smiling slightly at the name that had stuck. Alara's eyes fluttered closed, her small hand still holding loosely onto Vincent's larger one. The fairy lights cast warm shadows across her face, making her look almost ethereal in the gentle glow. Her breathing settled into a steady rhythm, matching the quiet beep of her heart monitor. Vincent sat quietly, listening to the peaceful sounds of the room, the soft whir of oxygen, the distant melody of crickets through the window, the occasional gentle footsteps of nurses in the hallway. Everything felt right, as if all the pieces of a complex puzzle had finally found their proper places. Hours passed, and Vincent remained, watching over Alara as she slept. Occasionally, he would step out briefly to check on the facility's operations or speak with the night staff, but he always returned to his post beside her bed. The moon traced its path across the sky, casting different patterns through the windows as the night deepened. During one such check, when he returned to Alara's room, he found her still peacefully asleep, her face relaxed and serene. Mr. Squeak gleamed softly in its stand, the golden varnish catching the moonlight. As Vincent moved to adjust her blanket again, he noticed something partially hidden beneath her pillow, a corner of white envelope peeking out. Carefully, so as not to disturb her sleep, he eased the envelope out. Written on the front in Alara's careful handwriting were the words, "For Mr. Vincent, open if I'm sleeping too long." Vincent stared at the envelope for a long moment, his throat tight with emotion. He didn't open it, couldn't open it. Instead, he gently placed it against his chest, right over his heart, and resumed his seat beside her bed. His hand found hers again, holding it gently but firmly, as if trying to anchor her to the present moment. The room seemed to hold its breath, existing in a space between reality and dreams. A small speaker on the bedside table played a very soft violin piece, one of Sienna's early compositions, creating a cocoon of gentle music around them. The fairy lights twinkled like earthbound stars, and the musical mobiles turned slowly overhead, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Near Alara's bed, a sketchbook lay on the table, its cover visible in the soft light. The title, written in her distinctive childish script, read, "The Songs We Didn't Finish Yet." Beside it, scattered sheets of paper showed her unique way of notating music, a combination of traditional notes and her own invented symbols, each page filled with the promise of melodies yet to be heard. Vincent sat through the night, keeping his vigil as the moon continued its journey across the sky. His hand never left hers, and the envelope remained pressed against his heart, its contents unopened but its message clear, a bridge between now and later, between what was and what might be. The night nurses moved quietly past the room's door, occasionally peering in to check on their patient. They would see the same scene each time, the small girl sleeping peacefully in her lavender-dressed bed and the normally imposing businessman sitting beside her, transformed by the soft light and softer emotions into something entirely different. A guardian, a protector, a father. The room held them all, Ilara's steady breathing, the quiet violin music from the speaker, the gentle glow of fairy lights, and Vincent's unwavering presence. Together, they created a moment of perfect peace, suspended in time like a note held at the end of a beautiful song. The autumn light had grown softer over Sienna's house in the week following the grand opening performance. The hallways that had once echoed with applause now carried gentler sounds, children's laughter, piano notes drifting from practice rooms, and the steady rhythm of nurses making their rounds. Vincent had become a familiar presence, his suit jackets replaced by comfortable sweaters, his commanding stride softened to match the peaceful pace of the house. He'd taken up residence in one of the guest rooms, a modest space compared to his penthouse, but it felt more like home than anywhere else had in years. The children greeted him by name now, some calling him Mr. V or Piano Man. The staff nodded warmly when he passed, no longer seeing the stern businessman, but rather a man transformed by love and purpose. But with each passing day, Vincent noticed the changes in Alara. Her brilliant smile remained, but it came with more effort. Her voice, once bubbling with stories and song, had grown quieter, like a melody played in pianissimo. Her small frame seemed to sink deeper into her wheelchair, though her spirit remained as bright as ever. She still insisted on their daily music sessions even when her fingers could no longer dance across the strings of Mr. Squeak. Instead, she would hum softly or conduct with slight movements of her hand while Vincent played. The golden violin stayed close, resting in its stand beside her bed, catching light and throwing it back in warm sparkles across her room. On this particular evening, the setting sun painted long shadows through the music room windows. Vincent sat in his usual chair beside Alara's bed, reading her a book about famous composers, when she stirred and whispered something so softly he had to lean closer. "Could we go to the piano?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Vincent hesitated, noting how tired she looked, but her eyes held that familiar determination that he'd come to know so well. "Of course," he said gently. "Let me help you." With practiced care, he lifted her from the bed, mindful of her oxygen tubes and IV lines. She felt lighter than ever in his arms, like a small bird. The nurses had shown him how to properly support her, and he moved with deliberate gentleness to the piano bench just a few steps away. The grand piano gleamed in the evening light, its polished surface reflecting the warm glow of sunset. Vincent settled onto the bench with Ilara secured safely beside him, supporting her small frame as she leaned against his side. "You play," she whispered, her breath coming in soft pants. "I'll breathe the beat." Vincent's fingers found their place on the keys, hovering for a moment before beginning the opening notes of The Bridge. The piece started softly, like dawn breaking over still water. He played it slower than usual, each note given space to breathe and resonate through the room. Ilara's breathing fell into rhythm with the music, as if the melody itself was giving her strength. Her eyes closed, a peaceful smile touching her lips as the familiar tune filled the air around them. The song they had created together, part Sienna's unfinished work, part Ilara's dream-heard melody, and part their own collaborative bridge between past and present, flowed through the room like liquid gold. Vincent felt each note deep in his chest, every key press carrying the weight of memory and meaning. The final movement of the piece, the part they had written together about meeting again after all the sad parts, seemed to hang in the air like suspended starlight. As the last notes faded into silence, Ilara opened her eyes and looked up at Vincent. Her gaze held a wisdom far beyond her years, a deep knowing that made his heart ache. "I think," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "it's time I go see Mommy now." Vincent's hands trembled slightly on the keys. He swallowed hard against the tightness in his throat, managing a small nod. Gathering her close, he hugged her as gently as he could, feeling her small arms wrap weakly around his neck in return. "Thank you," she whispered into his shoulder, "for fixing Mr. Squeak, and for fixing me too." That night, Vincent helped the nurses settle Ilara back into her bed. The room glowed softly with fairy lights, and her beloved violin rested faithfully beside her. She fell asleep with a peaceful smile, her breathing steady and calm, like the gentlest of lullabies. Vincent maintained his vigil in the chair beside her bed, watching the rise and fall of her chest, listening to the quiet beep of monitors. The moon traced its path across the sky, casting silver light through the windows that mixed with the warm glow of the fairy lights. When morning came, it arrived on silent feet. Vincent, who had dozed briefly in his chair, opened his eyes to an unusual stillness. The familiar beeping had ceased. The room held its breath. A gentle hand touched his shoulder, one of the night nurses, her eyes kind and sad. He knew before she spoke. Ilara was gone. Vincent stood slowly, his body stiff from the night in the chair. He moved to Ilara's bedside, taking in her peaceful expression. She looked as if she were simply dreaming of music, her face serene and beautiful in the early morning light. No tears came as he leaned down to press his lips to her forehead. "Thank you," he whispered against her cooling skin, "for staying long enough to finish the song." His hand brushed against something as he straightened, the envelope she had tucked under her pillow days ago. He had carried it close to his heart, but never opened it, afraid of what reading it might mean. Now, sitting back in his chair beside her still form, he carefully broke the seal. 3 years had passed since that quiet morning when Ilara left, and Sienna's house had grown from a single beacon of hope into a constellation of healing spaces. 3 homes now dotted the country's landscape, each one carefully designed to mirror the original's warm musical heart. Children with terminal illnesses who showed a special connection to music found their way to these sanctuaries, where medical care walked hand in hand with melody. The original Sienna's house stood proudly on its hilltop, its gardens now full and lush, with climbing roses framing the entrance. The violin-shaped garden that had once been just an architect's drawing now bloomed with life, its paths worn smooth by wheelchair tracks and small footsteps. Ilara's step, that first stone Vincent had laid, remained at the garden's heart, its inscription now weathered by sun and rain but still clearly legible. Vincent himself had changed as much as the house he'd built. His once perfect suits gave way to comfortable cardigans and soft cotton shirts. The sharp edges of his business persona had mellowed into something gentler, more approachable. Silver threaded prominently through his hair now, and laugh lines had begun to replace his former stern expression. He'd stepped away from his corporate empire, choosing instead to spend his weekends teaching music to the children who came to stay at Sienna's house. On this particular evening, the music hall buzzed with excitement for the annual recital called The Bridge. It had become a tradition, drawing people from across the country to witness the magic that happened when children facing life's greatest challenges found their voice through music. The hall looked much as it had that first night, though now the walls displayed framed artwork from past and present residents. Ilara's crayon drawings held places of honor, including her sketch of the bridge that had given the recital its name. The amber lights still cast their warm glow, and the grand piano still commanded center stage, though it now bore the loving marks of daily use. Vincent sat in the front row, program in hand, watching as each young musician took their turn. Some played from their wheelchairs, others from their beds. Each performance met with genuine appreciation from the audience who understood the courage behind every note. As the evening progressed, a small girl in a polka dot wheelchair was introduced. Her name was Maya, and she looked barely old enough to reach the violin strings. Her wheelchair had been decorated with musical notes painted along the spokes, and her eyes sparkled with barely contained mischief as she was wheeled to center stage. When she began to play The Bridge, Vincent leaned forward slightly. The opening notes were familiar, the same melody he and Ilara had crafted together all those years ago. But then, halfway through, something changed. Maya's bow danced across the strings with unexpected playfulness, introducing a light, spirited variation he'd never heard before. The new section sparkled like sunlight on water, weaving joy through the piece's usual solemnity. Vincent's eyes widened in surprise. He knew every version of this song, had played it countless times, had taught it to dozens of children. But this was entirely new, yet somehow felt perfectly right, as if it had always been meant to be there. After the performance, while other audience members mingled during the reception, Vincent made his way to Maya. She sat by the refreshment table, happily munching on a cookie, her small feet swinging beneath her wheelchair. "That was beautiful playing," he said, kneeling down to her eye level. "I've never heard that middle part before. Where did you learn it?" Maya grinned, cookie crumbs dotting her chin. She glanced around as if sharing a secret and said, "There's a gold violin in the music room. It plays it by itself sometimes." She shrugged, reaching for another cookie. "I just copied what I heard." Vincent felt a familiar warmth spread through his chest. He knew exactly which violin she meant. Mr. Squeak, with its golden varnish and metallic flakes, still kept on its special stand in the music room. Later that night, after the last guests had departed and the cleaning crew had finished their work, Vincent found himself drawn to the music room. Moonlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. The gold-plated violin, Mr. Squeak, rested on its stand, positioned so the moonlight caught its surface and made it shimmer. Vincent walked over to the stand and carefully placed Ilara's old sheet music beside it. The pages, now laminated and framed to preserve her crayon markings and childish notations, caught the same moonlight that made the violin glow. He traced his finger along the edge of the frame, remembering how her small hands had drawn those notes with such determination. The piano beckoned to him from across the room. He settled onto the bench, his fingers finding their place on the keys without thought. The new version of The Bridge, Maya's version, flowed from his memory through his hands. The playful middle section danced through the quiet room, and just as he reached the end of that surprising variation, he heard it. A soft, clear echo from the violin string, as if someone had drawn a bow across it with the lightest touch. Vincent didn't turn around. He didn't move at all. He just smiled, eyes closed, feeling the music surround him like an embrace. "The bridge is still open," he whispered into the moonlit quiet. If you enjoyed the story of Ilara, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.